Good morning, Mr. Orwell. Bonjour, Monsieur Orwell.
Hello, Sublation media viewers. It's me again, Douglas Lain. In this video, I'll present a conversation with Ben Burgis on the topic of state censorship, outlining the meaning of the First Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, and trying to rehabilitate the cliché that the year 1984 never ended. In 1984, everyone wanted to know whether Orwell had gotten it right. Opinions varied. In the West, the book was interpreted as an indictment of the Soviet Union. Reagan's America, with its Rubik's Cubes, Walkmans, and celebrities, Boy George, Brooke Shields, Michael Jackson, was thought to be a refutation of Orwell and his vision of a totalitarian future society.
Good morning. You've made it, and we've made it to 1984. You and I are here today to say hello to a notorious new year as we recover from saying goodbye to an old one.
On January 1st, 1984, the Fluxus artist Nam June Paik got a jump on the other commentators. The man who would later coin the phrase electronic superhighway broadcast a refutation of George Orwell on WYNET TV in New York, FR3, French National Television in France, WDR in Germany, as well as KBS in South Korea. The refutation took the form of a newscast mixed with a variety show and was called Good Morning, Mr. Orwell. It featured performances from Fluxus artists such as John Cage, pop acts like Peter Gabriel, Laurie Anderson, the Thompson Twins, and Oingo Boingo, and many others. The program reached 25 million viewers and was funded by South Korean state TV. Nam June Paik was excited by the power of digital technology and believed that the personal computer would bring freedom to China. In 2001, Paik was interviewed for the online magazine Rhizome. In this interview, he said, "George Orwell was wrong after all. When he wrote 1984, he didn't foresee the internet." The internet that Nam June Paik celebrated as a tool of liberation in 2001 was only a year old when Good Morning, Mr. Orwell was broadcast in 1984. Now that TCP/IP is 41 years old and the WWW is 35, it's easy to understand that Paik's celebrations were premature, but it is also easy to forget the depth of Orwell's horror. On March 27, 1947, Orwell gave an interview from his deathbed. He was asked whether he believed that his novel 1984 depicted an accurate portrait of the future. He responded that something like 1984 would actually happen. He said, "If it does, there will be no emotions except for fear, rage, triumph, and self-abasement. The sex instinct will be eradicated. We will abolish the orgasm. There will be no loyalty except loyalty to the party. But always there will be the intoxication of power. Always, at every moment, there will be the thrill of victory, the sensation of trampling on an enemy who is helpless. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever." But that may not be the worst of it. In Orwell's 1984, the conditions imposed by Big Brother were experienced by the characters as oppressive, as a misery, even by those who were most adept at doublespeak. Today, our dissatisfaction is difficult to express. The totalitarian nature of society has been reified. What does that mean exactly? Totalitarianism has been reified? To begin with, here's a clip of Andrew Feenberg from a lecture entitled Lukács's Theory of Reification and Contemporary Social Movements.
Okay, so to begin, let's define reification. I'm using the term in the sense in which it was introduced by Lukács in History and Class Consciousness in 1923. Reification, according to Lukács, means taking social relations for things. This definition follows from the etymology of the word, since race is the Latin word for thing, hence thingification. An institution, for example a university, is in reality a complex of social relations. but it appears as a solid and substantial thing, like a natural object. Breaking with the illusory thinghood of social institutions and recovering their contingency, Lukács calls dereification. This idea is usually explained as a theory of ideology, but implied in the contrast between social relations and things is a deeper argument concerning the nature of action, or practice as Lukács calls it. At this level, the theory of reification provides structure. At this level, the theory of reification explains the relation of structure to agency. Reification provides structure through determining a specific type of practice that stabilizes and reproduces the institutions, while dereification involves another type of practice with the power not only to penetrate the illusion of reification, but to transform the structures it establishes. So, because we all act like SFU is a university, SFU is a university. It's a reified object, but it's contingent on our believing in it, right? Acting according to the rule of the type of object that it is. But de-reifying the university is something that we're not encouraged to do by the administration.
To say that the authoritarian and totalitarian characteristics of our society are reified means that the practices that reproduce the institutions that control and dominate us have been obscured and confused to such an extent that we don't really see them. This reification of authoritarianism is so profound that it threatens to obscure society or sociality altogether. We are reaching a point where our subjectivity, our individuality, and our responsibility for the world seem to be on the verge of disappearing. Or that's what a philosophy professor from West Texas suggested was happening back in 1991. Rick Roderick, in a lecture recorded as part of the series produced for the Teaching Company and entitled Habermas and the Fragile Dignity of Humanity, argued that Orwell was an optimist because Orwell assumed that the people would be able to remember themselves, hold on to their minds, despite the totalitarian character of our social world, despite this world's reification.
Television tries to interpret itself to us, bypassing the upper brain functions and directly feeding into our minds. This is why I said off camera between classes that Orwell was a pie-eyed optimist. 1984 arrived in sort of the early 70s, and Orwell's vision of a horrible future, which was a boot stomping on a human face forever, is a utopian image because he assumed there would be resistance and human faces, both of which may turn out to be false. So, I mean, 1984 is not a book that scares me anymore. I mean, it's again, I know that last time I outrageously said that Herbert Marcuse was the Norman Vincent Peale of the 60s. And now this time I've been forced to say that Orwell was an optimist, you know, a sort of my corollary to his little cautionary tale.
In 1988, 4 years after Paik celebrated the new globalism and our collective techno-freedom, the American dissident and Kyoto Prize-winning linguist Noam Chomsky warned that, appearances to the contrary, the West might not have avoided Orwell's vision as completely as was widely believed. He and Edward Herman wrote, in a book entitled Manufacturing Consent, that in countries where the levers of power are in the hands of a state bureaucracy, the monopolistic control of the media, often supplemented by official censorship, makes it clear that the media serves the ends of the dominant elite. It is much more difficult to see a propaganda system at work where the media are private and formal censorship is absent. Chomsky argued that the free press in the West operated under or through what he called a propaganda model. Rather than overtly censor, elites were able to filter the news, marginalize dissent, and broadcast messages that affirmed the corporate state's interests. What Chomsky didn't argue, what he couldn't predict 36 years ago, was that the reification of the corporate state would reach a point where direct and overt censorship would occur, that the bureaucracy in the U.S. could gain control, but this fact would not be widely recognized for what it was. What he couldn't know was that even his own readers and acolytes would fail to recognize when totalitarianism truly took hold in America.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Sublation Media. My name is Djene Bajalan, and I will be here, your masters of ceremonies, for this discussion between Douglas Lain, the king of Sublation Media, and Ben Burgis, the king of debate. So I think a good way to open up this discussion is perhaps for first Doug to lay out his position, and then Ben to lay out his position, and then hopefully we'll have a friendly and frank exchange of ideas between the two of them. So Doug, please take it away.
Sure, and I just want to begin by saying, Ben, one of the reasons I get so frustrated with many people around this issue is because I have been concerned about it for so long, and my view of the current moment informed by the past. And I don't see a lot of discontinuity. I see like an increasing encroachment of dictatorial state power. And so I'm going to start way back in November of 2002, when the Department of Homeland Security was founded in response to the attacks of September 11th. And to say at the time, libertarians and leftists objected to the organization's very existence, wondering why there was a need for such an agency, given that the FBI, NSA, and CIA were already tasked with enforcing federal laws and with protecting the nation. The Homeland Security focused on security, and this was thought to be another step towards creating some sort of military state within the United States, as the shift from law enforcement to security was aimed at hardening the nation against both external and internal adversaries. The Patriot Act came along shortly after. It granted the government massive surveillance authority, including granting the government the right to seize emails, books, records, and other items from any business, organization, or entity, provided the items are or for an authorized investigation that was obtained by a FISA warrant. FISA grants the FBI the right to bug or search without the standard of probable cause and in the name of security. The Total Information Awareness Agency was formed in 2003, and it created a surveillance program based on the concept of predictive policing. TIA was meant to correlate detailed information about people in order to anticipate and prevent terrorist incidents before they happened. The agency was something out of a Philip K. Dick novel, like actually the Minority Report, the novel. In 2013, Edward Snowden revealed that NSA was gathering information on all Americans through a partnership with telecommunication and tech companies. He exposed that there were departments within the government wherein people were given access to a system that could monitor nearly any active computer on the internet. And he described sitting down at his desk and just pulling up random people's computers and their screens and looking at their emails kind of at his own whim. On January 6, 2017, and I'm skipping way ahead here, there's stuff in between, but Jay Johnson, the head of the Department of Homeland Security, announced that all U.S. communication infrastructure was henceforth within the jurisdiction of the Department of Homeland Security. In November 2018, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Department was formed within the Department of Homeland Security. And in 2020, the Election Integrity Partnership was formed at the request of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Department and with federal funding. The Election Integrity Partnership then proceeded to create a system for tracking and censoring social media posts. You can find exactly how they operate and how they operated during the 2020 election by reading their final report, which was made public, called The Long Fuse. It is accurate to say that the EIP suppressed millions of posts online to protect national security, as understood by the Department of Homeland Security and the Cyber Security Structure Department, or CISA. After 2020, the EIP has shifted from election integrity to combating disinformation about COVID policies and also disinformation about the war in Ukraine and now the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as has the CIA, NSA, and a whole bunch of alphabet agencies within the federal government. The Twitter files revealed a systematic attempt to circumvent the First Amendment. Network of NGOs, nonprofits, and state agencies were not only censoring American citizens online in violation of their civil rights, but the long fuse exposed how these same organizations and federal agencies had developed relationships within mainstream news organizations and tech companies, setting moderation policies and directing what would be reported on and how. The war on disinformation is international, and so that's basically the first part. The second part is just to point out this is not in the United States alone. This is a kind of a war on speech that's being launched internationally and mostly within the West. I mean, there are other versions of it in other nations and in the East, but in the West, the UN has announced that the UN General Assembly has expressed concern over the proliferation of disinformation and has welcomed the efforts of the Secretary General to promote international cooperation in countering disinformation. In response to that, Secretary General has submitted a report based on information and best practices shared by states, entities, and others on countering disinformation. These are just little excerpts from the websites of the players here, and not all of them by any means. The EU has announced that they're reinforcing their actions to counter efforts by actors who spread disinformation to destabilize society and democracy, and they're trying to fight off those who would exploit crisis and put citizens' lives at risk. Off to the side, I written this down, but it's a fact. The EU defines disinformation as legal speech that is nonetheless a threat to to society or in citizens' lives. The reason why they define it that way is there are already laws on the books in all the EU nations to combat fraud and other forms of illegal speech. So it's worth remembering that to combat disinformation always means combating legally protected speech, even in nations with fewer free speech rights and, with less hard and fast rules than the First Amendment. But my favorite example of the war on disinformation is Sweden's. They have a psychological defense agency. They offer support to authorities and companies and organizations to contribute to strengthening the population's resilience against disinformation. But back in the United States, just recently, the Congress passed legislation granting the executive the power to declare that a website or app presents a national security threat if the platform offers basic communication features and has certain connections to any foreign adversary. Upon this declaration, the platform's owner must complete a divestiture or a similar transaction that the president finds adequate. And then if this transaction doesn't occur within 6 months, the platform will be banned in the United States. The bill specifically targets TikTok to complete this divestment process or be banned. But as the free speech group FIRE points out, the actual text of the bill would cover American corporations in general and American corporations with only tenuous or speculative connections to foreign adversaries. I'll just conclude by saying that if you read the book Manufacturing Consent towards the front of the book, not at the very beginning, but in the beginning, they write that Chomsky and Herman write, in countries where the levers of power are in the hands of a state bureaucracy, the monopolistic control over the media, often supplemented by official censorship, makes it clear that the media serves the end of a dominant elite. They go on to say it's more difficult to see a propaganda system at work where the media are private and formal censorship is absent. I would say that what I've discovered since reading the Twitter files is that even when the levers of power are in the hands of a state bureaucracy directly and is made publicly known, it's sometimes difficult to see the formal censorship that's at work in society. And leave it there.
Yeah, what really struck me mostly listening to Doug's opening was that I agreed with almost all of it, I think. And this is not, something that should surprise anybody who's followed my work over the years. This is these are all positions I've very consistently held, that, certainly that, that the expansion of state surveillance after 9/11 was a alarming development, that I'd never written about this specifically. I might have if I'd been writing in 2002, but that the Department of Homeland Security, being founded was a very bad thing. And specifically, right, just so this is clear, because I do think I have some disagreements with Doug that came out in the earlier discussion, but I think they're not super obvious, right? So I want to, I do want to say very specifically, I'm very disturbed by the sort of propagation of even the concept of disinformation or misinformation. I think that I think that like it's I think it's a creepy and unhelpful category, right? As opposed to just like somebody said something false or they lied, right? That there's a sort of bureaucratization there that's like almost like a pseudo medicalization or something, like it's a condition, that like spreads by contagion, misinformation. And I think that's massively unhelpful. I do just want to point to a couple of very specific things that I've written about this in the past. On the misinformation question, I wrote an article 2 years ago for the Daily Beast when the sort of calls to kick Joe Rogan off Spotify were kind of at their height. Called progressives who want Joe Rogan off Spotify should be careful what they wish for. I guess this is a little over 2 years ago, where I said that the podcasting was not a societal concern before it came onto the scene in about 2004. Imagine though a world where podcasts and services like Spotify were already up and running during the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. Who do you suppose would be more likely to meet the blunt end of the censorship hammer for misinformation in 2002? Podcasters who concurred with the CIA and the New York Times in claiming that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, or ones who claimed the Bush administration officials were conspiring to deceive the public? For anybody who remembers anything about the body politic of 2002, the question answers itself. If you think the lead up to the invasion of Iraq was an anomalous event and that authority figures in government and private industry rarely lie, examples like that might not bother you. But if you understand that corporations, politicians, and intelligence services lie all the time, it's hard to believe the consequences of weakening free speech norms and making it easier for tech CEOs to suppress misinformation would somehow end up favorable to the distant left. And while I will very freely admit to having, I think, partially downstream of some of the disagreements we do have, and partially just because the sort of way it works out and who else at outlets that I was writing for was covering it and everything, I've written much less about the Twitter files. But one thing I did write also for the Daily Beast, in December 2022, I wrote, "I'm sorry, but the Twitter files are not a, quote, nothing burger, unquote. The information revealed so far about Twitter's internal deliberations shows the company's content moderation decisions were often justified on grounds that the decision makers themselves found dubious. The company routinely honored censorship requests from powerful factions, and some political commentators were shadow banned in a way that appears to be inconsistent with Twitter's stated policies at the time." Examples we've seen at this point, I think this part was actually not true when the Li Fang part of the Twitter files came out, have focused on the complaints of conservatives. Many progressives have reacted by rolling their eyes, but this is a short-sighted response. Twitter is an important part of our digital town square, used by politicians, journalists, and ordinary citizens to disseminate news and make political appeals. Anyone who cares about free speech should care about this information. So I think there are like really wide areas of agreement here that I don't want to get lost. And I think part of my frustration with the earlier conversation was I feel like to some extent they were getting lost. And one of them is that, free speech is something that, socialist left should care about a lot. And certainly that any kind of expansion of, powers justified by national security is grounds for alarm. Certainly one of them is that, I don't think that state authorities should be in the business of, trying to protect people from misinformation. I also don't think that that tech oligarchs who run platforms should be in that business either, right? And I think this starts to take us to where there might actually be interesting areas of disagreement. So let me just really quickly rattle off, at least my position as I stated it in that conversation, so we can start to get at like where the disagreements are. So one is that I do sometimes worry, and maybe think this is nitpicky, but I do sometimes worry that Doug's way of presenting this gives us this kind of dichotomy that the two options for sort of concerns about, censorship and related issues are the Chomsky-Herman propaganda model, things that fit into that, and state censorship. I don't think that's an exhaustive dichotomy. I think that, and as I noted in that previous conversation, this is a place where I actually, oddly enough, maybe agree with a lot of positions that have been expressed over the years by conservatives and Republicans, which is that they've made the point often that there's a difference between a platform and a publisher, and it's an important and relevant difference. That, in fact, there are lots of Republican politicians over the years who sort of said, hey, if Twitter is going to act like a publisher, picking and choosing which opinions get to be expressed, we should withdraw this legal protection that it gets that's premised on it being a neutral platform. And that's, and I'm, I think in that case, the cure might be worse than the disease, but I'm very sympathetic to the underlying point. I do think that that's a profoundly important difference between something that's a platform where like anybody is supposed to be able to come express views, like the digital town square, like a real town square where everybody can come hold a protest, and a publisher. So it's not a violation of anybody, not only not a violation of the First Amendment, it's not even a violation of like free speech norms in any squishier sense for the New York Times to not publish every article that somebody wants to publish at the New York Times. But I do think that we should start to be concerned about free speech norms when platforms start to enact more censorious policies. This has been something I've been writing about since 2000 and like early 2021. And I think that the analogy I used last time was if a privatized mail service that carried some huge portion of the mail decided that it wasn't going to carry, Jacobin, or conversely, it wasn't going to carry the National Review or whatever, because it disapproved of the contents, or it wasn't going to carry, magazines whose editorial policies it considered to be Putinism, or, Putin apologism over the war in Ukraine, right? I would find that deeply alarming. And so I think that's a third category, right? That's not, the propaganda model is about publishers and the ways that they present the news. There's state censorship. I also think corporate censorship is a major concern. And I think that, I think this should lead us to be very concerned about, tech oligarchs owning this stuff. And I think that the difference between a private and a public mail service is telling. It would actually be a violation of the First Amendment if a public mail service decided it wasn't going to carry certain magazines because their political content. Unfortunately, it's not a violation of the First Amendment for a privatized one to do, which is, I think, a legitimate concern about important platforms being privatized. Okay, last point, because I know I've already been talking for longer than I wanted to, and it's a character flaw, and I'm working on it. But last point about this, where I do think that there's a disagreement, and maybe I wasn't that clear about it last time. I didn't really expect last time to get into a discussion about any of this stuff. But I think that there's on the constitutional question. So if we're interested in, if we're just asking a normative question, right? Is it good for for the Department of Homeland Security or government-funded agencies with connections you could chart out to it, or any of those people. Is it good for them to tell private platforms to censor people? I'd say no, of course not. I mean, I'm against corporate censorship, whether or not it includes that, right? Like, this is the kind of thing I'm always arguing, with libertarians about. I think the blacklist in the 50s would have been really, really bad, even if it was just studio bosses meeting among themselves and deciding to blacklist communists out of their patriotic zeal, without there being pressure from Congress. But is it unconstitutional? And there I would just really quickly say, I don't know. I'm not sure. I think that I know the Supreme Court is preparing to decide that, right? I mean, under the system we've got, if what we mean by is it constitutional is will the Supreme Court hold that it's unconstitutional, then I have to say I'm not wildly optimistic that they will, because I think it might be too close to a lot of activities that nobody normally considers to be unconstitutional. Like if the the CIA, like somebody from the government tells the New York Times, hey, it's not illegal for you to publish this story, but we're asking you not to as a matter of national security, and then they don't do it, right? I mean, I think that there's, like, courts, as far as I know, right, have never held that to be unconstitutional. I think there might be a certain amount of issue about the amount of, and I'm very far from being an expert on this, about the amount of pressure that's exerted. And I don't know. I mean, my sense of the last 20 years of the war on terror and, the national security state's, expansion even before that, is that, generally speaking, when the national security state asks a corporation to do something, they just do it. They don't actually have to be coerced to do it, right? They just roll over and do it, right? And the vast majority of cases. And I think that another issue I know is about the chain of causality. I've looked a little bit at some of the court documents where the sides are arguing back and forth about this, whether you can actually establish that, given the standards courts have used in the past about what it takes to count as a chain of causality, that that it wouldn't have happened but for the request. Is it? I don't know. There's, I know there are complicated legal arguments to be had there. I'm not, I'm certainly not an expert on them. I did express some uncertainty about this last time, which I still feel this time. I will generally say, if I just had to sort of put down some money as a hunch, I'd say, certainly based on what I've seen about the oral arguments, they probably won't decide that's unconstitutional. I also kind of don't see this as a central political question because, of course, the judiciary is the part of the state that's the most sealed off from public pressure by design, right? So we can kind of hope for or root for given outcomes to court cases, and it's like, look, if I had a button that would press, there's like, I get to decide whether the Supreme Court rules one way or the other way. I'd press the button to have them rule Doug's way. But I'm not wildly optimistic. And the thing I think that I would most want to focus on is, like, let's say best case scenario, they do rule that the bar is low enough that all of this stuff clearly violates it, which would be great, right? I would like it I would like it if that happened, right? I can see the legal argument the other way. I tend to be pretty cynical about the Supreme Court. I don't really think, I think they kind of decide what decision they want to make and, come up with a legal argument that fits it. And usually any clever constitutional lawyer can come up with one way or the other. And but I think that my main point, this will be the very last thing I say, I promise, I know I've been talking forever, is that I think even if that happened, there would be a large censorship problem remaining that's not reducible to the manufacturing consent issue. And now I'll shut up for a while.
Oh, say, can you see?
A point of confusion and difference between Ben Burgis and myself in this discussion revolves around the meaning of the First Amendment. I want to stand on the Constitution here, a document that is understood as being the fundamental law of the land.
This was not written for chiefs.
But I also want to insist that the enforcement of the First Amendment is not merely a matter of law. How can I say these two things at the same time? To begin with, the First Amendment sets a limit on the law. It is a law about laws. Here it is. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So it is a law, a fundamental law, but it is not a law aimed at us, the people, living in what's called the private sphere. Instead, it is a law aimed at the state. In order for it to apply to the state, we have to assume that there is a terrain outside of the state. That is, the private realm needs to exist. And we have to want it to continue to exist. Now, the reason the state exists, the reason we need a constitution, is because the private realm is in contradiction with itself. It can't manage itself.
The subordination of the state to society is the project of the bourgeois revolutions. And it's tragic that it had to take so much violence and so much chaos and so much confusion. But ultimately, that tragedy did win new ground for the revolution, right? There was the advancing of the project of the Third Estate's subordination of the aristocracy and the church to the needs of society. That's why it's first-time tragedy, right? There's a tragic element to the bourgeois revolution that it required this kind of political form, but it did emancipate society. Now the process of revolution is farcical because it not only are you not gaining new ground for society, you're losing all the rights that you've won. The state is reemerging as a capitalist state. That's what the significance of Louis Bonaparte is.
Before industrial capitalism, the word public was defined differently than it is today. In Kant's What is Enlightenment from 1784, he wrote, "The public use of one's reason must always be free, and it alone can bring about enlightenment among mankind. The private use of reason may, however, often be very narrowly restricted, without otherwise hindering the progress of enlightenment." The public use of reason he was referring to was not the state's use of reason or the government's use of reason, but the individual's use of reason. The private use of reason was the use of reason under contract. The private use of reason was the use of reason that was governed by property and by law. If we were to imagine that the state were to run all media, or to run the internet platforms, we should understand that these media platforms would be private in the sense that Kant meant it. The more aspects of life that are taken up by the state, the more of life is taken away from the public.
I did find that helpful and clarifying as a response, because but I guess one thing I'd push on a little bit, right, is you talk a little bit about like we can use the First Amendment as a bulwark, right, and I guess I'm a little curious about that we, right, like that this is because if we're because another thing you said is you weren't just talking about a narrow legal question, but of course the use of the First Amendment as a bulwark is either, is either about like what happens in court, which, I think the left sort of doesn't exist right now anyway, but like if to the extent that it does, has remarkably little power. But I mean, like, at least in theory, if we're talking about like policies, you could like try to start to build a movement for or whatever. There's some, as half-baked as it might be, there's some sort of theory of change there. Whereas with a court, you're literally just like, well, we'll see, right? Like we could just sort of hope, right? It's like it's like if the I don't know, the like if Michigan State beats the University of Michigan, I say, oh, we beat you guys. Well, I didn't really do anything. I just watched, right? But then you said that, so you did say it wasn't a narrow legal question, and I think that this is actually really important to narrow in on, because I think that might be getting to our most sort of important disagreement here, which is maybe not so much about whether, look, I'm very glad the U.S. is the First Amendment and that it does give us more protection, than people in lots of other countries, really just about any other country have. I mean, this is like what Noam Chomsky, gets at, and one of those surprising things he'll say sometimes when he says in certain respects the United States is the freest country in the world. That I think that's very good, right? But I think where there might be a little bit of I think a lot of a disagreement, right? I think the sort of maybe the most important thing is, should we primarily understand this as a question of the state encroaching on the private sphere? So like a private corporation is in the private sphere, except to the extent that it's entwined with the state, but like that's a bad thing, right? It shouldn't be. So we're sort of understanding ourselves as protecting the private sphere, which is where, Google and Twitter and, Facebook and all those people live, right? YouTube. Against, well, that's my timer, so I'm going to wrap up. Against the encroachment of the state, and I think not, right? Like, because I think a big part of the problem here is that part of the effect of First Amendment law is that once you're in the public sphere, you have way more protection against censorship than you have in the private sphere, right? That this is, so for example, if, Rutgers University tries to fire me because I don't know, I said that we should be pushing for a negotiated settlement in the Ukraine, and they're like, oh, you're a Putin apologist, we're going to fire you. Even as an adjunct, I could at least theoretically take them to court and probably get my job back, because if I was being fired from a public university for provably being fired for a constitutionally protected political opinion, right, it would be illegal. It would violate the First Amendment. Whereas at a private university, no problem whatsoever to do that, right? Private universities have a legal right to fire people for anything that their contract doesn't specify. They can't fire them for, pretty much. And similarly, that you have the same, and again, I find that mail carrier, hypothetical pretty compelling on this, et cetera, right? So I think that and in fact, look, if threatening Twitter, for example, that we are going to change the law, right? We're going to take away this provision. I'm forgetting what the number is, right? It's 2 something of the Communications Decency Act that says, well, because it's a platform, not a publisher, it has all these protections against being sued. If the state threatened to take that away unless they started really acting content neutral and stopped censoring people for the contents of their opinion, I would cheer for that, right? I'd say, yeah, great, right? That's an expansion of free speech, right? In this case, through the the sort of threat of state aggression against the private sector, because I don't think that I don't think the private sector is a bastion of free speech. I think in a lot of ways it's the other way around, which isn't to say that we should replicate, the Soviet media system, that they obviously, you do need to think hard about independent civil society, et cetera. But like, I would really push back against that framing that about the state and the private sector.
In Capital, Marx wrote, "In place of the pompous catalog of the inalienable rights of man comes a modest Magna Carta of a legally limited working day, which shall make clear when the time which the worker sells is ended and when his own begins. But Marx also wrote, "But the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. The centralized state power with its ubiquitous organs of standing army, police, bureaucracy, clergy, and judiciary, organs wrought after the plan of a systematic and hierarchic division of labor, originates from the days of absolute monarchy, serving nascent middle-class society as a mighty weapon in its struggle against feudalism." While it's true that the working classes will have to seize state power in order to smash it, it is not true that the slow expansion of the administrative state is also a slow-motion seizure of the state by the working classes. Despite Marx's celebration of the modest victory of a limit placed on the working day by the Factory Acts, what he celebrated more was the enforcement of these laws by organized labor. Further, while the capitalists within civil society operate under objective pressure to maximize the exploitation of workers, the pressure to present a diversity of opinions, to publish works that are critical of the established ruling powers, to spread what's called disinformation, is hardly intrinsic to capitalist enterprise. When the state aims to regulate a realm that Chomsky and others rightly note was already a realm where consent was manufactured, we should wonder just who they are wanting to limit. In this case, it is not corporate media, but social media users who the state is taking aim at.
I think that, libertarianism is bad, and I sort of see unhelpful traces of it in several of these arguments, right? So in other words, for one thing, just on the most esoteric philosophical point, I don't think property rights start with our ownership of ourselves. I think that conceptualizing like bodily autonomy or a right to our labor as a kind of property right, I would argue really misses the point. And I also think it just doesn't get us what we want out of a conception of bodily autonomy or a right to or not be forced to labor and all of that stuff. Like, so for example, a core feature of property rights is that if you own something, and you have a right to sell it unless you've contracted it away, right? Whereas I think probably nobody here would agree with, say, Robert Nozick that we should have a right to voluntarily sell ourselves into slavery. And indeed, right, at the end of the Working Day chapter of Capital, Marx is saying that the 10 hours bill, why that's so important is that there's this collective barrier against people being forced to sell themselves into, he sort of says the equivalent of slavery, right, voluntarily, right? And he says this very dialectical thing about, we're expanding our freedom by losing the right to individually, voluntarily do that, which I think is correct. And so, but I don't want to lose the part of what Doug says, because there are a lot of disagreements here, but I think there's a agreement that's also worth highlighting, which is that Doug and I both think a thing here that that a lot of people who think of themselves as Marxists and socialists don't think, although we, I think, believe two different versions of it. And what that is that socialism shouldn't be understood as a rejection of like sort of Enlightenment liberal values, but as something like a fulfillment of them.
It's worth returning to the First Amendment to understand what's at stake in this disagreement about the level of censorship we are facing. The significance of the fact that the censorship was not an accident born out of the contradictions within civil society, not merely a manufacturing of consent through the free market, but was perpetrated by the state itself. To understand that difference, we should recall again that the administrative state arose to manage the contradictions in society brought on by industrialization. The Constitution, on the other hand, was written when most workers were artisans. By the time of Abraham Lincoln, a time when industrialization was well underway, even he believed that wage labor would be temporary. He said that the prudent, penniless beginner in the world labors for wages a while, saves a surplus with which to buy tools or land for himself, then labors on his own account for another while, and at length hires another new beginner to help him. While this no longer reflects reality, Abraham Lincoln's vision of the independence of labor is closer to aligning with socialism than Bernie Sanders' vision of bringing Denmark to America, or even FDR's promise of freedom from want. For contemporary leftists, realizing what has been lost, understanding the power the state has taken for itself, even as socialism has suffered defeat after defeat, requires us to rethink and overcome some of our unexamined prejudices. When libertarians and conservatives champion the Constitution and insist upon an originalist interpretation, we should understand that their nostalgia may be more revolutionary than our moral reasoning. We may be witnessing the total collapse of that old constitutional order with its civil liberties and rights right now.
Once you recognize that this is a whole of government, whole of society effort, what you're really looking at is a class, a ruling party. And the ruling party, you might say that its core is the sort of defense establishment that is actually really the NATO defense establishment. It's not the U.S., it's NATO, Five Eyes, as you saw through your experiences in the UK. The defense establishment is the core, and then the sort of organs of the ruling party in the respective countries where this is in place are the core of this class. But the class itself represents a concentrated form of political power. And corresponding to that concentrated form of political power, it has its own prerogatives in terms of the kind of policies it wants to implement, in terms of the direction it wants laws to take, in terms of opposing populism.
It's just a sort of technocratic establishment worldview, isn't it?
As I try to take up the full significance of the attack on the First Amendment that's taken place over the last 7 years, I find myself returning to the Situationists, to Guy Debord, in my own nostalgic way. And I am struck by how Debord's book, The Society of the Spectacle, is as much a book about what has been lost to the past as it is about the struggle for socialism in his own time. I find myself less confused by the way Debord finds contemporary life in the 60s to be lacking in comparison to the past. In his film, We Go Round and Round in the Night and Are Consumed by Fire, Debord narrated images of contemporary life in the 60s and the lifestyles that were on offer back then, and intoned, "They die in droves on the freeways, and in each flu epidemic, and each heat wave, and with each mistake of those who adulterate their food, and each technical innovation profitable to the numerous entrepreneurs for whose environmental developments they serve as guinea pigs. Their nerve-wracking conditions of existence produce physical, intellectual, and psychological degeneration. Never before has a system of tyranny maintained its lackeys, its experts, and its court jesters so shabbily. They work overtime in the service of emptiness, and emptiness rewards them with coinage in its own image. This is the first time that poor people have imagined themselves to be part of an economic elite, despite all the evidence to the contrary. Not only do these miserable spectators work, nobody else works for them, least of all the people they pay. When I was in my 20s, I thought I heard an admiration for the old aristocracy in those lines. In reality, all there is here is a raging against the way the old feudal order has reproduced itself in new and even more impoverished forms. The delusion that we are living in a world defined by progress, a world wherein the threat of totalitarian control and the smashing of thought is a paranoid fear, rather than a slowly unfolding reality, is giving way, I think. Even back in 1984, when Nam June Paik insisted on optimism, the first song on his broadcast by Peter Gabriel and Laurie Anderson, a song named Excellent Birds, was a cold, detached, inhuman, and ultimately pessimistic number that really gave the game away. Here are a few lines from that number. This is a picture. Looking out. I'm watching now. But when I see the future, I close my eyes. Their dancing is clearly meant to evoke the image of marionettes as they dangle above a flat, blank, and impossible space on invisible strings. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.